Today's episode is called John Brown's Raiders. Each of these characters were mostly footnotes during their own lives and have largely remained so today.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome to Well-Hung History, where we tell the tales of the condemned and the executed. I'm Terry Allen, and thanks for coming along for the ride. Today's episode is called John Brown's Raiders, and it is the companion piece to our previous episode focusing mostly on John Brown himself. So we invite you to listen to each of these back to back to get a fuller picture of the wider story. We will be concentrating on the colorful lives of the wayward men who fought alongside Brown at the infamous raid on Harpers Ferry in 1859. Each of these characters were mostly footnotes during their own lives and have largely remained so today. But their stories are fascinating and worth remembering. Despite sometimes scant historical record, we will do our best to resuscitate them here. So come join us and take a ride back in time and learn about some people you likely have never met in your history books. Before we get to the Raiders, a little bit about John Brown himself to provide some very basic background for those who may be unfamiliar with his story. He is most known as one of the most famous abolitionists in American history, but unlike many of his contemporaries who were pacifists, Brown was unrepentantly bellicose, believing that the wicked institution of slavery could only be banished to the dustbin of history through armed violence. Though he had been an ardent, even fanatical opponent of human bondage his entire life, it was not until he reached his mid-50s that his forceful rhetoric would turn to deadly deeds. The bloodshed he unleashed in the final years of his life occurred at two distinct places, the first being the murders of pro-slavery men along the Pottawatomie Creek in a weeks-long skirmish known as Bleeding Kansas in 1856. And the second and most pertinent to our show today, the raid on the U.S. Armory at Harpers Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia, in 1859. In both cases, he was aided by an admittedly small but enthusiastic band of followers that pledged their lives to him and to the wider cause. And it's those mostly unknown men that are the focus of our show today. It's not the norm here to kick off an episode with a quote, but we'll do just that in order to give us all a very general composition of who these men really were. It comes to us from a newspaper description following the debacle that was Harper's Ferry, and it goes like this. Quote,
It would be hard to find again such a strange party as that which upheld John Brown in his daring expedition. Hopeful because they were brave, and brave with the surety of right on their side, they came together with the wide difference in character and education, and were held together by their love for liberty. Some of them could claim only the refinement of his love, while others were fitted for any position of honor that could be given them.
To be sure, this unlikely menagerie was indeed strange. They ranged in age from 17 to 59, race, 17 white, 5 black, in education, some barely literate, if literate at all, and some of very high intellectual achievement. They also varied in many other ways, notably military experience, from none to 4 escapees who would eventually join the Union Army. And 2 of the raiders, Shields Green and Dangerfield Newbie, were former slaves. There were 22 all told that participated in the raid, including Brown himself, but for the sake of time, we will focus on just 15 of them. In the end, 10 of these men were killed in the fighting, 7 were captured and hanged, and 5 escaped. So who exactly were these apparitions of times gone by? Well, after a short break, we'll find out. Let's begin with some of the guys that fought alongside Brown at Bleeding Kansas, and as such would have known him well and stayed alive during the intervening 3 years between that episode and what would happen later. In no particular order, we'll lead off with John Henry Kegi, who was 24 at the time of the raid. He was born in Ohio to a family of Swiss descent, and he was Brown's second in command, having been bestowed the rather gaudy title of Secretary of War. Probably the best educated of the lot, he packed a lot into his short life. He was a stenographer, attorney, and journalist. Quite a resume for a 24-year-old, I would say. He was the associate editor of the Topeka Tribune and was an assignment reporter for both the New York Post and the New York Tribune, covering the events in Kansas. He also contributed many articles to various abolitionist magazines in the North and Midwest. Like Brown, he was a teetotaler and swore off a life of vice. Interestingly, though, he was a known agnostic and no doubt spent many a night debating religion with Brown, an ardent Calvinist. He had declared himself an abolitionist at a very young age and moved to Kansas to join the Free State settlers there even before most of the hostilities took place. He met Brown in Lawrence and participated with him in several skirmishes, eventually being tried for arson and murder by a territorial judge, but he managed somehow to escape jail. After the dust started to settle, Kegi remained fiercely loyal to Brown and was his chief negotiator in charge of procuring and storing the weapons intended for Harpers Ferry, which he originally arranged to be stored in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, before switching their movement to a stash house in Maryland prior to the raid. At Chambersburg, he and Brown met in secret with perhaps the most famous abolitionist of the day, Frederick Douglass, and another eventual plotter and former slave named Shields Green. Stay tuned for more about him later. It was at this meeting in Chambersburg that Brown divulged his plans for the raid. Though Douglass listened intently and probably provided some tacit support, he later claimed that he admonished Brown not to proceed, thinking it would be a fool's errand to do so. Well, Douglass was right, and among those killed during the raid on the armory was John Henry Kegi, who was shot by militiamen in a desperate and futile attempt to escape by fording the Shenandoah River. He, like the others killed on that fateful day, was buried in a crudely built wooden box near the site where he was felled by bullets. 40 years later, his bones were exhumed and transported to a mass tomb on the grounds of the Brown farmhouse in North Elba. And if you feel like taking a trip to the Adirondacks, you can see his name etched there, along with those of several of his comrades. Another compatriot from the Kansas days was Jeremiah Anderson, born in Indiana, 1833. He had come from a long line of slaveholders as recent as his grandparents, and he detested the institution, and he committed himself to its abolition. He briefly attended Knox College in Illinois in preparation for training as a minister, but he too heard Kansas calling, and he soon made his way there to join the Free Soil fight. He soon took up arms under the command of the controversial Captain James Montgomery, future Civil War commander and close ally and admirer of John Brown. Anderson was captured by the pro-slavery factions and imprisoned for 10 months at Fort Scott before he too escaped and rendezvoused again with Brown. He is quoted of saying the following: "Millions of fellow beings required of us. Their cries go out to the universe daily and hourly. Whose duty is it to help them? Is it yours? Is it mine? It is every man's, but how few there are to help. But there are a few who dare to answer this call, and dare to answer it in a manner that will make this land of liberty and equality shake to the center." He remained loyal to the end and reconnoitered with Brown and the other raiders at the Kennedy farmhouse in Maryland in advance of the raid. But he would ultimately become one of the first killed in the fighting, being mortally wounded by a bayonet there in the first hours of the siege. He was 26 years old. His body was soon carried away and handed off to Winchester Medical College for medical dissection, and the location of his grave, if there is one, remains unknown. Next is Albert, born Absalom Hazlitt, born in either 1836 or 1838, the record differs, in Pennsylvania. He was of a humble background and moved with his wife and 6 children to Kansas in 1857, where he also made the acquaintance of Brown, and he fought alongside Kegi and also under the command of Captain James Montgomery. Following the sudden death of his father, he returned to PA to help attend to the family farm. But while back home, he received word via messenger of Brown's designs on Harper's Ferry, and he eagerly traveled there to join the other raiders. His role during the raid itself is somewhat murky. It is known that he and another member, Osborne Anderson, were not present at the armory when the bullets began flying. Why, I can't really say. What is known is that he and Anderson were among the few who managed to escape the carnage, but in the case of Hazlitt, his time on the lam was very brief, as he was apprehended on the Virginia-Pennsylvania border soon after. He was tried at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and then returned to Charlestown near Harpers Ferry to await his execution. He wrote in a letter to a well-wisher in his final days, saying, quote, "If I had 10,000 lives, I would willingly lay them all down for the same cause." Another of the handful to escape the botch scene at the armory was Charles Plumber Tid, and that's because he never actually joined in the fighting, but this was for very good reason. Tid was born in the wilds of Maine in 1834, and he moved several times before arriving in Kansas in 1856, where he met Brown and joined his Free Soil forces. While there and in Missouri, he was credited with helping to secret 11 slaves north into freedom. Tid joined Brown following his departure from Kansas and traveled extensively with him throughout the northern states and Canada in search of fresh recruits. Though he was highly skeptical of the efficacy of the Harpers Ferry plan, he nonetheless elected to participate, writing home to his family in New England, quote, "This is perhaps the final letter you will ever receive from your son. The next time you hear of me, it will probably be through the public prints. If we succeed, the world will call us heroes. If we fail, we shall hang between the heavens and the earth." Well, as the day of reckoning came, Brown ordered Tid to go to capture a nearby slaveholder, kidnap him, and emancipate his slaves and bring them back to the farmhouse to help guard the cache of weapons stored there, all of which he did. But as he prepared to advance, he and the others in the safe house received word that the attack had gone horribly wrong, and advancing towards the armory meant certain death. So upon hearing this, he, Barclay Copic, John Cook, and Owen Brown fled into the hills and escaped. After reaching safety in Canada months later by foot, he soon enlisted in the 21st Massachusetts on the Union side, the outset of the Civil War, where he concealed his true identity and went by simply Charles Plummer. But his days were numbered, as he soon died of disease in North Carolina the following year. Aaron Stevens is up next, and he's a very noteworthy member of the crew, serving as Brown's right-hand man regarding military matters. He was the only member to have received formal Army training, though his role in the service was mired in controversy. He was another New Englander, born in Lisbon, Connecticut in 1831. But at 16, he ran away and he joined a Massachusetts regiment of volunteers and is sent off to fight in the Mexican-American War. While enlisted in Company F of the United States Dragoons, trouble soon found him when he is accused of mutiny and engaging in a drunken riot followed by an assault of Major George Blake at Taos in the then New Mexico Territory. But the record shows us that it was probably Blake who was the drunkard, as Stevens was known to abstain from alcohol throughout his entire life. But nevertheless, it's the word of the colonel versus the word of the private, and Stevens and 3 others were sentenced to hang. This would not be the last time that Stevens was sentenced to hang. The sentence was quickly overturned, though, by then Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. Remember him? And instead, Stevens and the other would-be mutineers were resentenced to 3 years hard labor. And this was to be served at the barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Well, as seems to be the case with so many of Brown's men, he manages to bust out of the big house. Now, I don't know how he managed that. Fort Leavenworth was and is no Podunk County jail. And I think it's interesting to note that Stevens arrived in Kansas not by choice like the others, but by force, with his passage there surely paid by the U.S. government. He soon hooks up with Brown and introduces himself as Captain Whipple. Gotta love that one. And he would soon become one of his most devoted and important loyalists to the bitter end. While in Kansas, he engaged in the expected fighting and notably shot and killed a man named David Cruz while attempting to emancipate one of his slaves. In preparation for Harper's Ferry, Stevens served as the drill master of the otherwise untrained and unprepared raiders. He was generally considered to be second in command, maybe along with John Kegi. He was among the first to advance on the armory, but once inside the firehouse or the engine house where the gang was holed up, he argued heatedly with Brown and insisted that they attempt to flee rather than remain and surely be killed. He was overruled. Instead, Brown sent him outside along with one of his sons, Watson. Watson was immediately shot and mortally wounded by an inflamed militiaman, and so was Stevens, or Whipple if you prefer. But badly wounded by bullets to the chest and face, he somehow survived, only to be taken into captivity. Brown's state-appointed attorney described Stevens as follows.
Stevens is in the same cell as Brown. I have frequent talks with him. He is in a most pitiable condition physically, his wounds being of the most painful and dangerous character. He has now 4 balls in his body, 2 of these being about the head and neck. He bears his suffering with a grim and silent fortitude, never complaining and absolutely without hope. He is a splendid-looking young fellow, such black and penetrating eyes, such an expansive brow, such a grand chest and limbs. He was the best and in fact only man Brown had who was a good soldier, besides being reliable otherwise.
Now this sounds like a love letter, and if you've listened to the companion episode, you'll hear similar praise for the men whom one would think would be so despised. He was finally hanged at Charlestown on March 16, 1860, along with Hazlitt and some of the others, whom he hugged and even kissed on the scaffold. His last words to Brown were, "Captain Brown, I'll see you in a better land." Now let's mention 2 of John Brown's sons who had been with him in Kansas and joined their father in the raid, and that's Owen and his much younger brother, Oliver. Owen, then 35, was one of the few to escape, and Oliver, just 20, would not be so lucky. We'll begin with Owen, the eldest and perhaps most loyal of all the Brown boys, and was active in virtually all of his father's plottings. But while he was said to have physically resembled the old man, that's pretty much where the similarities stopped. He was said to be extremely friendly and kind and always willing to share a laugh. He suffered an injury to his arm when young and remained partially crippled throughout his life. He never married. He was considered an eccentric, and after surviving all the calamity he witnessed, he was fond of saying when asked later about his occupation, quote,
"I am an engineer on the Underground Railroad."
In the months prior to his rendezvous with the others at the Kennedy farmhouse, he was dispatched to find suitable sites deep in the mountains of Appalachia, where slaves abetting the would-be insurrection could find refuge. He did this enthusiastically, and he reported his findings to his father once he returned to the base camp. As mentioned, he was ordered to stay behind with a few others to guard the cache of weapons and therefore never saw any fighting. This command, no doubt, saved his life. Following the debacle at Harpers Ferry, with a stiff bounty on his head, he set out on foot in what would become an arduous 3-month journey before finally reaching the safety of friends in Ohio. During this sojourn, he traveled by night and lived off of raw potatoes and corn and nearly starved to death on numerous occasions. He would soon retreat to an ascetic, even hermetic life in a little cabin near his brother Jason and his family near Akron. He then followed his brother and brother-in-law Henry Thompson and their families all the way west to Pasadena, California, where he was surprised to find himself a local celebrity in a community that was known to be nostalgic about his family. He died there of pneumonia in 1889 at the home of his sister Ruth, long outliving the other raiders by more than 15 years. Though known to eschew close friendships during his life, his funeral was attended by almost 2,000 mourners, virtually the entire population of that town at the time. Well, the send-off of Owen's kid brother Oliver could not have been more different. He was the youngest of the Brown boys, born 1839, and he joined his father in Kansas at just 16 years of age, before being killed in the raid at 20. He was said to be Marion John Brown's favorite son, though obviously what potentially may have shown in his youth was snuffed out long before it could come to fruition. Oliver exhibited a deep hatred of slavery that was probably second to only that of his father. As a teenager, he even burned the pulpit of a church that refused to host an abolitionist meeting. He was mortally wounded in the firehouse during the early hours of the raid, eventually expiring literally at his father's feet before the looming army burst through the steel doors to take the living fighters captive. He was buried in an unmarked grave near the site of his death, only to be exhumed decades later after the man who had dug the grave was given a few dollars to disclose its location. His remains were then shipped north to the mass tomb at North Elba, New York. And finally, the last man we'll mention who fought with Brown in Kansas and Harpers Ferry, and that's John Cook. And his reputation amongst the supporters of the plot, both then and now, is mired in skepticism. Born in Connecticut around 1830, he had studied at both Yale and Oberlin before heading off to Kansas at the onset of the Troubles there, where he became acquainted with Brown and the others. His primary role was that of a lookout and spy, and he was dispatched to Harper's Ferry more than a year before the raid to run reconnaissance and generally embed himself into the fabric of that small community. And to this end, he took jobs as a lock tender and tutor and rented a room at a local boarding house in his own name, all the while learning the topography of the area and its transportation routes in and out of town. He even married and he fathered a child while residing there. On the fateful day, he also did not see any fighting, as he had been commanded to kidnap local slaveholders and encourage their slaves to join the fight. Like the others that remained behind, once he got word of the utter failure of the effort, he fled the farmhouse for his life, briefly becoming, quote, the most wanted man in America. But brief it was, and he was found out within days and returned to Charlestown to stand trial for the same charges as the rest that remained alive: murder, treason, and inciting slave insurrection. He was found guilty on all fronts and sentenced to death. His brief stint in jail, though, is what would lead to his cloudy, posthumous reputation. In an effort to save his own skin, presumably, he provided the full list of his fellow conspirators, and he was the only one of the group to have done so. But this confession was to be in vain, and he went to the gallows just like the rest. As a result of this snitching, no church in his adopted hometown of Brooklyn would host his funeral, and so it was conducted in a private residence. Well, let's take a short break, and we'll close this episode out by discussing some of those conspirators that joined Brown's brigands just in time for the big day. Next is John Copeland, a man of mixed race, who joined with Brown in Oberlin, Ohio, where he was then living after studying at the college there. He was born free, so-called, in North Carolina in 1834, and he moved with his family to Ohio in his youth, where he became deeply ensconced in the anti-slavery movement. His own father had been emancipated by his white grandfather, who in fact had been his owner. Such were the often convoluted bloodlines of the Old South. Copeland's role in the raid was to assist Kegi in securing the rifle works, but this attempt failed badly, and so the two jumped into the Shenandoah in a desperate plight to save themselves. And as we've already seen, Kegi was shot and drowned, but Copeland was unharmed, but he was arrested and hauled away for trial. Like most of the others that were captured, he maintained a steely and brave posture, and he freely admitted to his role and his unbroken faith in the wider project. And here again, I'll read a short quote of fond remembrance from an unlikely source, that being the prosecuting attorney Andrew Hunter. Quote, "From my intercourse with him, I regarded him as one of the most respectable prisoners we had. He was a copper-colored Negro, behaved himself with as much firmness as any of them, and with far more dignity. If it had been possible to recommend a pardon for any of them, it would have been for this man Copeland, as I regretted as much, if not more, at seeing him executed than any other of the party." At the scaffold, he echoed the words of several of the others. Quote, "I am dying for freedom. I could not die for a better cause. I had rather die than be a slave." He went to meet his maker on December 16th, and after his family tried and failed to receive his body, his remains were sent off for medical dissection. Back in Oberlin, a funeral was held before an open and empty casket, and this was attended by 3,000 mourners. Moving on to the Copic Brothers, Edwin and Barclay. Born into a Quaker family near Salem, Ohio in 1835 and 1839, respectively. They befriended Brown in Iowa, where each was working as teamsters in the Underground Railroad. They then eventually followed him eagerly to Virginia. Edwin is noted for two things. He was probably the only fighter in the engine house to be completely unscathed, and he was also known as the one who fired the fatal shot, felling the local mayor. He was captured and hanged at Charlestown along with some of the others, and his funeral back home in Ohio also drew more than 2,000 mourners in the Quaker community from which he hailed. There's not much to say about young Barclay Copic, as he was just 19 years old when all hell broke loose. He was one of the ones left behind at the farm to guard the weapons. And as such, he was one of the 5 to escape, and one of just 3 to reach freedom entirely, landing in Canada after months on the lam. But as was the case with Charles Tid, alluded to earlier, he too later joined the Union Army as a recruiter, and he was killed in a train derailment soon after. The next 2 men on the list are notable as both were born into slavery. They were Dangerfield Newbie and Shields Green. Newbie was of mixed race. His father, and therefore de facto owner, Henry Newbie, was white, and his mother Elsie was a slave owned by a neighboring family. Though strictly forbidden by law to marry, they did live for many years as a couple and sired several other children. Dangerfield himself eventually married another slave named Harriet, with whom he had 7 children. She and the kids were held in bondage in Arlington, Virginia, on a plantation owned by a man named Jesse Jennings. At some point, Newbie, his mother, and siblings were emancipated by Henry and sent to live in Ohio, where he found work as a blacksmith. But his wife and children remained enslaved in Virginia. It was in Ohio that he met John Brown Jr., who lived in the same county. But at this point, something fundamental to our story begins to take shape, that being Newbie's primary inspiration for joining the raid. Unlike the others who were fueled by righteous passions and a glorious cause, Newbie's were more practical, as he saw the raid as the only tact available to him to free his family from their chains. He had tried to do so peaceably on several occasions with earnings from his work, only to be rebuffed either by the double dealing of their master or failing to raise the required funds. The accounts on this differ. 44 years of age at the time of the raid, Dangerfield Newbie was by far the oldest of the raiders, other than Brown himself, who was 59. He was shot in the melee by some sort of crudely fashioned ammunition fired by one of the members of the bloodthirsty militia. His body was left to rot for 24 hours and was said to have been badly mutilated by the mob, hacking off his limbs and genitals and slowly feasted upon by hogs. It is unknown what became of his enslaved family back in Arlington. And then there's Shields Green, sometimes called the Emperor. Very little is known of him, and he remains one of the more obscure members of the raid. This dearth of evidence is no doubt the result of him being born into slavery, and he was probably illiterate. He left behind no written details of his life or the events that transpired. We do know from recollections published by Frederick Douglass years later that he was born into slavery in Charleston, South Carolina, and somehow managed to finagle his way north to Rochester, New York, where he found refuge for almost 2 years at Douglass's house there. He was probably bound for Canada, but after being introduced to Brown by Douglass, he abandoned that idea and anxiously signed on to the scheme. At Harpers Ferry, he was accosted, but was otherwise unwounded and hanged in December, his body sent for medical dissection. Now we'll turn our attention to John Brown's son Watson, who had not joined his father in Kansas, but did so at Harpers Ferry. Very bad move. He stormed the armory alongside his father and brother Oliver, and like them, he would soon pay the price. As mentioned earlier, he was sent in the midst of the fighting alongside Aaron Stevens under a white flag to arrange a truce or surrender. But no sooner as he walked outside, he was almost immediately shot by one of the militia, and he was mortally wounded. He was not shot by the professional soldiers there, who were under the code of war and would not have done so. He was somehow curried back into the firehouse with the others, but he was very, very badly wounded, and he writhed in agony on the floor for the next few hours. Some of the few survivors of the assault later claimed from their jail cells that he begged the others to put him out of his misery. But his father forbade this, and instead he expired at about 3 p.m. before the army burst through to secure the compound. Now, what happened to his body is worth noting. As his corpse lay on the ground following the fighting, it, along with some of the others, as we've discussed, was collected and carried off to nearby Winchester College for anatomical dissection. As this was one of Brown's sons, the cadaver was prized and was drained of its blood, and its skins were made into moccasins. The body was embalmed with some sort of a stain and injected into the arteries, and was soon displayed for all to see, under which read the inscription, "John Brown's son, thus always to abolitionists." This was a cheeky play on words to the Virginia state motto, "Thus always to tyrants," the same words shouted by John Wilkes Booth a few years later after assassinating Abraham Lincoln. But the Union Army exacted its own revenge a few years later when it burned the college to the ground in 1862. The final raider we'll discuss in any detail here is Lewis Sheridan Leary. He was a freedman of mixed race who moved his family to Oberlin to escape the prejudice of his native North Carolina. He was a cousin of Hiram Rhodes Revels, later to become the first black senator in U.S. history during Reconstruction. Soon after being briefly jailed in Ohio for abetting an escaped slave, he traveled to Cleveland to hear John Brown make a speech, and it was probably there that he learned of the plot and agreed to join, though he did not inform his family of this. He was mortally wounded in the fighting, and he died in agony from his wounds a few days later. His wife later remarried a prominent abolitionist named Charles Henry Langston, and it was through this bloodline that he would become the posthumous step-grandfather to the great writer of the Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes. There were 6 other raiders not covered here for the sake of time, and they are Osborne Anderson, Francis Jackson Merriam, William Lehman, Stuart Taylor, and Brown's son-in-laws Dauphin and William Thompson. Of these 6, 5 were killed at Harpers Ferry, and one, Osborne Anderson, escaped, and he lived on until 1873.
This concludes the latest episode of Well Hung History. Run away and cry now, but before you do, make sure to subscribe and leave us a killer review. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all the rest. New episodes drop regularly. Tom Payne Productions, all rights reserved and preserved.